The evening sun hung low over the Montana ranch, painting the grasslands in shades of copper and rust. Ethan Cole sat on the porch of the house his hands had built 35 years ago, watching his grandson prepare for a journey that would take him away come morning. The boy was 18, strong-shouldered and restless, in the way young men get when the world beyond the horizon calls louder than the safety of home. William stood at the corral fence, one boot propped on the lower rail, staring at the horse he would ride west at dawn. His posture carried the weight of unspoken questions, the kind that plague a man on the eve of a leap into the unknown. Ethan recognized that stance. He had worn it himself once long ago, though back then he had been running from something rather than toward it. The old man's hands rested on the arms of his chair, weathered and scarred from decades of hard work. At 65, Ethan Cole had built a life that would outlast him. 3 generations of his blood walked this land. The ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, testament to choices made when he was younger than William was now. But the boy did not know the full story of how it all began. Not yet. William turned from the fence and walked toward the porch, his shadow long in the failing light. He climbed the steps and sat beside his grandfather, silent for a long moment. Inside the house, sounds of the evening meal being prepared drifted through the open window. Sarah was there, Ethan's wife of 34 years, her hair now silver but her movements still sure. Their daughter Grace, now a woman of 42 with children of her own, helped her mother set the table. "Grandfather," William said, finally, his voice uncertain, "how did you know you were doing the right thing when you left everything familiar to find something you weren't even sure existed?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He let the questions settle between them, like dust after a horse's passage. The sun touched the western ridge and the light shifted from copper to gold. A breeze carried the scent of sage across the porch. "I stood where you're standing once," Ethan said quietly. "Autumn of 1807, I was 30 years old. Didn't have a dollar to my name, nothing but a horse and a pain I was running from." William shifted to face him, recognizing the tone in his grandfather's voice. This was not going to be one of the old man's brief answers. This was the beginning of something larger. "That year I heard a child crying by the side of a trail in the middle of nowhere," Ethan continued. His eyes had gone distant, seeing something beyond the present moment. "And I made a choice. I could have ridden past, should have by any measure of the life I was living. But I stopped." He paused, and the silence stretched long enough that William almost spoke. But something in his grandfather's stillness kept him quiet. "That one decision," Ethan said, "that single moment of choosing to help instead of riding on it gave me everything. This ranch, your grandmother, your father, you." He turned to look at his grandson directly. "All because I was brave enough to stop running." William leaned forward. "Tell me." Ethan nodded slowly. "The hardest lesson I ever learned was this. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply stop. Stop running from pain. Stop pretending he doesn't need anyone. Stop believing that strength means carrying everything alone." He settled back in his chair. "Let me tell you about the day I learned that lesson. About a little girl who asked a stranger for help and a stranger who was fool enough to say yes." The old man closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It carried the weight of memory, the texture of a story long held but never fully told. "Montana Territory, late September 1877. I was 3 years into running from the biggest mistake of my life. The Drifter, Montana Territory. September 1877. The late afternoon sun stretched Ethan Cole's shadow long across the Montana plains as he rode. Dusty, his buckskin gelding moved with the steady rhythm of a horse that knew no destination waited at the end of the trail. The animal's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air before settling back to earth. Around them, the grasslands rolled endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional clusters of scrub brush and weathered rock formations that thrust up from the ground like the bones of some ancient beast. Ethan sat easy in the saddle, his hat pulled low against the slanting light. His clothes carried the dust of 6 territories and 3 years of constant movement. The leather of his saddlebags had been worn smooth by weather and use. Inside those bags lay everything he owned in the world. A bedroll carefully maintained despite its age. A tin cup dented on one side from the time a spooked horse had kicked it across a camp. A Bible his mother had given him, its pages unread since the day he left Ohio a lifetime ago. One spare shirt. a box of ammunition for the Colt revolver that rode his hip, and the Winchester rifle in its scabbard against his leg, and a leather pouch containing $43 in mixed coins and crumpled bills. $43. Enough to keep moving, not enough to stop anywhere. That was the point. Behind him lay Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, a string of territories where he had worked cattle drives when the season called for it, mended fences for homesteaders who paid in cash and asked no questions, broke horses for men who needed the work done and did not care about the shadows in a drifter's eyes. He took whatever honest labor came his way, collected his wages, and moved on before anyone could mistake his presence for permanence. Ahead lay nothing in particular. Another town eventually, another job, another few weeks of work before the restlessness set in and the trail called again. This was the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. It did not matter which. The result was the same. He preferred it this way. The emptiness, the quiet, the blessed anonymity of a man who belonged nowhere and to no one. There was a purity in that kind of isolation, a simplicity that asked nothing of him except that he keep moving. Plans he had learned had a cruel habit of falling apart. Hope was a luxury men like him could not afford. The only certainty in this world was that if you kept riding, yesterday's failures could not quite catch up. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and distant water. Dusty's ears flicked forward, then back, but Ethan paid no mind. His thoughts drifted, where they always did, as daylight began to fade, to a farmhouse in Missouri that he would never see again, to a woman's laughter that he had spent 3 years trying to forget, to a child who would have been 3 years old now if things had been different, if Ethan had been different. He shook his head sharply, forcing his attention back to the trail. That life was finished, done, buried in ground he would never visit. This was what remained: leather reins and calloused hands, open country under a vast sky, the simple mathematics of survival that required nothing more than the ability to keep moving. Then he heard it. At first, the sound was so faint that Ethan thought it might be a bird, some creature in distress perhaps, a wounded animal or a coyote pup separated from its pack. But as Dusty's steady steps carried them closer to a cluster of scrub brush and weathered rocks off the main trail, the sound clarified into something that made Ethan's chest tighten, despite every instinct he had spent 3 years building. A child, crying. The sound was high-pitched and desperate, carrying the particular quality of terror rather than simple hurt. It came from beyond the brush, perhaps 30 yards off the trail, a spot where the land dipped slightly, creating a natural hollow that would be invisible to anyone passing by without stopping. Ethan's hands pulled the reins without conscious thought, and Dusty halted immediately. The buckskin stood perfectly still, ears trained on the source of the crying. For a long moment, horse and rider remained frozen, and Ethan felt the familiar war begin inside him. Every instinct he had carefully cultivated over 3 years of drifting screamed the same message. Keep riding. Children meant families. Families meant complications. Complications meant exactly the kind of entanglement he had sworn to avoid. Nothing good came from stopping. Nothing good came from caring. He had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, and he would not forget it again. His right hand moved almost of its own accord, touching his heels to Dusty's flanks in the signal to move forward, to leave this behind, to let someone else deal with whatever crisis had produced those desperate sobs. But the crying intensified. It took on a ragged, breathless quality, the sound of someone who had been screaming for help until their voice began to give out, the sound of hope dying. Ethan's jaw clenched. His hands refused to cooperate with his intentions. Instead of urging Dusty forward down the trail, he found himself swinging his right leg over the saddle and dropping to the ground. His boots hit the hard-packed earth with a sound that felt like surrender. "Not my business," he muttered, looping Dusty's reins over a low branch of scrub brush. The horse regarded him with dark, patient eyes that seemed to hold judgment. "It's not." But his feet carried him toward the sound anyway. His right hand rested on the grip of his revolver more from habit than any expectation of danger. He pushed through the brush, and the crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. "Hello!" His voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from days of silence. Then he saw her. A little girl no more than 6 or 7 years old crouched beside a flat stone in the hollow beyond the brush. Her face was a map of tears and dirt streaked with the evidence of hours of crying. Her dress, once perhaps a faded blue, was torn at the hem and stained with dust. Dark hair fell in tangled waves around thin shoulders that shook with each breath. When she looked up at him, her eyes struck Ethan like a physical blow. They were brown and wide and filled with a desperate hope that was almost painful to witness. In them, Ethan saw something he had been running from for 3 years. He saw need. He saw trust placed in a stranger simply because that stranger had stopped. He saw for one terrible moment another child, one that existed only in his imagination, one he would never meet. The little girl scrambled to her feet, stumbling toward him with an urgency that made him step back instinctively. But she kept coming, and small hands grabbed at his sleeve, his vest clinging with surprising strength for someone so small. "Please," she whispered. Then louder, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush. "Please, you have to help. My mama, she's sick, real sick. She won't wake up right, and she's burning up, and I don't know what to do, and nobody will help, and please, please." The words dissolved into fresh tears. Ethan's mind, trained by 3 years of trail life to assess situations, quickly began sorting through possibilities. None of them were good. A sick woman, a child alone on the plains, no sign of anyone else. It could be fever, could be cholera, could be any number of things that killed people out here, where doctors were scarce and help was scarcer. Could be a trap, whispered the cynical part of him that had kept him alive. But as he looked down at the girl's tear-stained face, at the genuine terror in her eyes, at the way her whole body trembled with fear and exhaustion, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that whatever this was, it was not a trap. It was something worse, a real problem with no easy answers, the kind of situation that demanded he become someone he had deliberately stopped being. "Where's your family?" he heard himself ask. His throat felt tight. "Where's your mama?" The girl's face flooded with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Home. Our cabin, it's not far, maybe 2 miles that way." She pointed west toward the darkening horizon. "Please, mister, please come. I've been trying to get help all day, but nobody—" Her voice broke. Nobody would listen. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. What kind of place was this where a child begging for help got turned away? But even as the thought formed, he knew the answer. The kind of place where people had their own troubles, where strangers were viewed with suspicion, where getting involved in someone else's misery might bring complications no one could afford. The kind of thinking he had adopted himself. "All right," he said quietly, and watched hope kindle in her eyes like a struck match. "Show me." She grabbed his hand before he could say anything else. Her fingers were small and cold despite the lingering warmth of the day. She tugged him back toward where Dusty waited, and Ethan whistled low. The buckskin lifted his head, ears forward. "What's your name?" Ethan asked as he gathered the reins. "Grace," she said, practically vibrating with urgency. "Grace Bennett, and my mama is Sarah. She got sick 3 days ago, and it just keeps getting worse. And I tried to make her better, but I don't know how, and—" "Easy," Ethan said, cutting through the torrent of words with gentle firmness. He swung into the saddle, then reached down. "Can you ride?" Grace nodded frantically. Ethan grasped her under the arms and lifted her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She weighed almost nothing in all sharp angles and desperate energy. The moment she was secure, she pointed west. "That way. Hurry, please, hurry." Ethan touched his heels to Dusty's sides, and the buckskin moved into an easy lope. The sun continued its descent, shadows lengthening across the grasslands. Grace sat rigid in his arms, her whole body leaning forward as if she could will the horse to move faster. "How long have you been alone with your mama?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice level. "Since Papa died," Grace said. The words came out matter-of-fact in the way children spoke of unbearable things. "Last winter, he was cutting wood and a tree fell wrong and hit him in the chest. Mama said his ribs broke inside and there wasn't nothing to be done. He died the next day." Ethan's chest constricted. A widow and child alone through a Montana winter. The fact that they had survived spoke to either tremendous strength or sheer stubborn luck. "What about neighbors?" he asked. "Anybody nearby who could help?" Grace's shoulders hunched. "The Swensons live about 5 miles east, but Mrs. Swenson told Mama after Papa died that they couldn't afford to be helping us all the time. Said we should go back east where we came from. And the Coopers are even farther, and they never liked us anyway because Mama didn't go to their church. The casual cruelty of it settled over Ethan like a familiar coat. He had seen it before, had practiced it himself if he was being honest. People were quick enough with sympathy when it cost them nothing. But when real help was needed, when someone's survival depended on genuine sacrifice, most folks found reasons to look the other way. When did your mama get sick? Started 3 days ago. At first she just said she was tired, but then she got the shakes real bad and started burning up. Yesterday she stopped making sense when she talked. And this morning she wouldn't wake up right. Her eyes would open, but she didn't see me. She kept saying things that didn't make no sense, talking to Papa like he was still here. Delirium, high fever, 3 days in. Ethan had seen enough fever deaths on cattle drives to know the signs. If Sarah Bennett had been alone with just a frightened child to care for her, odds were good she hadn't had proper water, proper cooling, proper anything. You went for help today. Grace nodded miserably. I ran to the Swensons' first light this morning, and Swenson opened the door, saw it was me, and said they'd already done enough for us, and she wasn't about to catch whatever sickness we had. Wouldn't even let me come inside. Then I tried the Coopers, but nobody answered even though I could see smoke from their chimney. So then I thought maybe if I went to the trail, somebody passing through might help. Somebody who didn't know to turn away. Her voice had gotten smaller with each sentence, as if she was only now realizing how close she had come to complete failure, how narrow the margin had been between finding help and returning to watch her mother die. You found me, Ethan said simply. I heard your horse, Grace whispered. I'd been sitting by that rock for hours and I'd about given up. And then I heard hoofbeats, and I thought maybe this time, maybe just this once, somebody would listen. The weight of that hope, the desperate faith this child had placed in a complete stranger, simply because he was the only option left, settled over Ethan like a physical burden. He wanted to tell her she had been lucky, that he had almost not stopped, that every instinct he possessed had told him to keep riding. But she was 7 years old and terrified, so instead he asked how much farther just over that rise. Grace pointed to a low ridge ahead silhouetted against the evening sky. Our cabin is in the hollow on the other side. Ethan urged Dusty into a faster pace. The buckskin's breathing remained steady despite the added weight and quickened gait. They crested the rise and Ethan's heart sank at what he saw below. The cabin huddled in the shallow valley like something trying to disappear into the earth. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the weathered logs, the gaps visible between them, where chinking had fallen away. The roof sagged on one side, patched with what looked like canvas or hide. A lean-to that might have once housed livestock stood empty, its door hanging at an angle. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cooling evening air. No sign of life. No movement. Nothing to suggest anyone lived there at all except for a small garden plot, mostly withered now, and a rain barrel by the door. This was not just isolation. This was abandonment, a family forgotten by their community, left to survive or fail on their own. That's home, Grace said quietly. Something in her voice suggested she knew exactly how it looked, knew the judgment that formed in most people's eyes when they saw it. Ethan said nothing. He just guided Dusty down the slope toward the cabin. As they drew closer, more details emerged. Clothes hanging stiff on a line never brought in. A bucket overturned by the door. Garden tools scattered as if dropped mid-task. These were the signs of crisis of a household where the normal rhythms had shattered. He pulled Dusty to a stop by the cabin door and dismounted, then lifted Grace down. She immediately ran to the door, pushing it open without hesitation. Mama, I brought help. Ethan followed her inside and the smell hit him first. Sweat sickness, the close air of a room that had not been opened in days. The cabin's interior was dim evening light filtering weakly through a single small window. His eyes adjusted slowly, taking in details. A table with 2 chairs, both handmade but well-crafted. Shelves mostly empty, containing a few dishes, some jars, a tin cup. A cold fireplace, its ashes days old. And in the corner, a narrow bed where a woman lay motionless. Grace was already at her side, small hands touching her mother's face. Mama, wake up. Please wake up. I brought somebody to help. Ethan moved closer, his boots loud on the plank floor. Sarah Bennett lay on her back, covered with a thin quilt. Her dark hair, so like her daughter's, spread damp across a pillow that had clearly been wet and dried several times. Her face was flushed with fever even in the dim light. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, rapid and irregular. He knelt beside the bed and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him pull back instinctively, dangerously high, the kind of fever that could cook a person's brain if it lasted too long. "Mama," Grace's voice cracked. "Mama, can you hear me?" Sarah's eyes opened, slightly unfocused and glassy. Her lips moved, forming words that made no sound. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "Grace, I'm here, Mama, and I brought help, a man who's going to make you better." Sarah's gaze shifted toward Ethan, but he could tell she was not really seeing him. She was looking through him or past him to something only fever visions revealed. "James," she whispered. "James, you came back." Grace's face crumpled. "That's Papa's name," she told Ethan. "She keeps thinking he's here." Ethan stood, his mind racing through what he knew about frontier medicine, which was not much beyond the basics learned on trail drives. High fever needed to be brought down. That meant water-cooled compresses, possibly willow bark if any could be found. But this had been going on for 3 days. Sarah Bennett needed a doctor, needed real help, not the fumbling attempts of a drifter who knew more about horses than healing. He turned to Grace, keeping his voice steady. "Is there a town nearby, somewhere with a doctor?" "Willow Creek," Grace said immediately, "about 8 miles northeast. But Mama said we couldn't afford the doctor, that he charges $20 just to come out here, and we don't have that kind of money." 8 miles in daylight on a fresh horse, maybe an hour's hard ride. In the gathering darkness, over unfamiliar terrain, closer to 2 hours. And then convincing a doctor to come, gathering supplies, making the ride back. They were looking at 4 hours minimum, probably 5 or 6. Ethan looked at Sarah's flushed face, at the way her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements. Did she have 6 hours? Did she even have 3? "Listen to me," he said to Grace, crouching down to meet her eyes. "I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "First, I need water. All you can get. Is that rain barrel full?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Get me that bucket by the door and fill it. Then I need any clean cloth you can find. Old shirts, rags, anything. And I need you to get that fire going. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. Yeah. We got wood stacked outside." "All right, go. Move fast, but don't spill the water. We need every drop." Grace darted for the door, and Ethan turned back to Sarah Bennett. He had made his decision without consciously realizing it. He could not get to town and back fast enough. His only chance was to do what he could here now and hope it was enough to keep her alive until morning, when he could ride for proper help in daylight. He pulled the thin quilt back, noting Sarah's sweat-soaked dress. The fever needed to be fought, which meant getting her temperature down however possible. He had seen cowboys survive fever by being dunked in cold streams, seen others die despite every effort. There were no guarantees out here, just desperate measures and prayer, though Ethan was not much for praying anymore. Grace returned, struggling under the weight of a full bucket. Water sloshed over the sides as she set it down beside the bed. "I got cloth too," she said, producing an armful of what looked like old flour sacks and a worn shirt. "Good girl," Ethan said and meant it. "Now the fire, fast as you can." While Grace worked at the fireplace, Ethan dunked one of the rags in the cold water and wrung it out. He pressed it against Sarah's forehead, and she stirred slightly, a small sound escaping her lips. He worked methodically, cooling her face, her neck, her arms, replacing the rags as they warmed from her skin's heat. "James," Sarah murmured again, her head turning restlessly. "The baby. Where's the baby?" Ethan's hand stilled for just a moment. Then he continued working, jaw tight. Grace appeared at his elbow, having coaxed flames to life in the fireplace. "She keeps saying that about a baby. But there ain't no baby, mister. Just me." "Sometimes fever makes people remember things," Ethan said quietly. "Things that hurt." He did not elaborate, and Grace did not press, but the implication hung in the air between them. Loss upon loss upon loss. For the next hour, Ethan worked in steady rhythm. Cool water, fresh rags, checking Sarah's temperature, trying to get her to take small sips of water when her eyes opened enough to attempt it. Grace helped without being asked, fetching more water, keeping the fire fed, hovering close to her mother's bedside. As full darkness fell outside, Sarah's breathing seemed to ease slightly. The desperate gasps became a bit more regular. Her fever remained dangerously high, but perhaps not quite as scorching as before. Small mercies, Ethan thought. Out here, you took what you could get. Is she going to die? Grace asked suddenly, her voice very small in the firelit cabin. Ethan wanted to lie to offer easy comfort, but this child had already survived more truth than most adults ever faced. She deserved honesty. I don't know, he said, but I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she doesn't. And come first light, I'm riding to town to bring back a doctor. You'll come back, the question held desperate hope and learned skepticism in equal measure. You won't just leave. Ethan met her eyes, seeing the fear there. Not just of losing her mother, but of being abandoned by the one person who had stopped to help. And in that moment, he understood what it meant to make a promise that mattered, the kind that could not be walked away from. I'll come back, he said. I give you my word. Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if she had seen something there that satisfied her. I believe you. They worked through the evening in quiet partnership, child and stranger, bound by shared purpose. Ethan found himself talking to Sarah as he worked, keeping up a steady stream of words, even though she likely could not hear him. You're doing fine, ma'am. Just keep breathing. Your daughter's here, and she's the bravest little girl I've ever seen. Rode out alone looking for help. Didn't give up even when folks turned her away. You raised her right, so you need to fight now. Need to hang on because she needs you. And I'm guessing you're not the kind of woman who gives up easy. Not if you made it through a winter alone out here. Around midnight, Sarah's eyes opened more clearly than they had since he had arrived. Her gaze found Grace first, and something like recognition flickered there. Grace, she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, raw and broken. I'm here, Mama. Grace grasped her mother's hand. I'm right here. I'm sorry, Sarah breathed. So sorry. Should have taken you away from here. Don't talk like that, Grace said fiercely. You're going to get better. This man, he's helping. And tomorrow he's bringing a doctor. Sarah's eyes shifted to Ethan, and for the first time he saw real awareness there, along with something else. Shame, he realized. She was ashamed to be seen like this, helpless and dependent on a stranger's charity. Don't, he said quietly, understanding without being told. You've got nothing to apologize for. You're sick, and that's not something you chose. Don't have money for a doctor, Sarah managed. We'll figure that out tomorrow, Ethan said. Right now you just focus on staying alive. Who are you? Name's Ethan Cole. I was passing through and your daughter asked for help, so I helped. Something that might have been a smile touched Sarah's cracked lips. Lucky, she whispered. She was lucky. We both were, Ethan said, surprising himself with the truth of it. Sarah's eyes drifted closed again, but her breathing had settled into something more natural, less desperate. The fever still burned, but she had crossed back from whatever edge she had been teetering on, at least for now. As false dawn began to gray the cabin's single window, Grace finally succumbed to exhaustion, curling up in the chair beside her mother's bed, her small hands still clasping Sarah's. Ethan kept his vigil, changing the water, when it grew warm, keeping the fire fed. And somewhere in those quiet hours, he felt something he had been running from for 3 years finally catch up to him. Purpose. The sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed doing. It terrified him more than any outlaw or stampede ever had, because he had learned that purpose came with a price, and he was not sure he could afford to pay it again. But as the first light touched the eastern sky, and he prepared to ride for Willow Creek, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he had already made the choice. The moment he had heard a child crying and decided to stop, he had committed himself to seeing this through. Whatever it cost, whatever it demanded, whatever it changed in him. He would keep his promise. Ethan's voice faded into the evening air. William sat motionless, absorbing the weight of what he had just heard. The sun had set fully now, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the Montana ranch. From inside the house came the sound of his grandmother calling them to dinner, but neither man moved. You could have ridden away, William said finally. Why didn't you? Ethan turned to look at his grandson, seeing in the young man's face an echo of the question he had asked himself countless times over the years. Could have, he agreed. Should have, by any logic I'd lived by for 3 years. But sometimes, William, the bravest choice isn't the smart one. It's the necessary one. He paused. I stopped because a little Girl asked me to. And I stayed because I'd given my word. Not because I was noble or good, but because walking away would have made me the kind of man I didn't want to be. William nodded slowly, understanding, settling over him like the evening shadows. What happened next? Next morning, I rode to Willow Creek. Ethan said, his eyes growing distant again, and learned that keeping promises can cost more than you ever imagined. The sun broke over the Montana plains in shades of copper and gold as Ethan tightened Dusty's cinch and checked his saddle one final time. The buckskin sensed the urgency that had driven them through the night, shifting beneath Ethan's hand, with the restless energy of a horse bred for hard country and long distances. Behind him, the cabin door stood open, and through it he could see Grace sitting rigid in the chair beside her mother's bed, her small frame silhouetted against the firelight that still burned despite the dawn. He walked back inside his boots, heavy on the worn floorboards. Sarah lay as she had for hours, her breathing shallow but steady, her fever-flushed face almost peaceful in the early light. The water bucket sat half empty beside the bed, surrounded by damp rags that testified to the long night's battle. I'm leaving now, Ethan said quietly, crouching beside Grace's chair. But I need you to keep doing exactly what we did last night. Cool water on her face and neck. Try to get her to drink whenever she wakes. Keep that fire going, but not too hot. Can you do that? Grace nodded, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. How long will you be gone? 4 hours if everything goes right. Maybe 5. If I'm not back by noon, it means I had trouble finding the doctor or convincing him to come. But I will come back. Understand, no matter what. What if Mama gets worse while you're gone? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the terrible possibilities neither wanted to name. Ethan reached out and placed his hand over Grace's small one where it rested on the chair's arm. Then you talk to her, he said. You tell her about things she loves. Remind her why she needs to fight. Sometimes that's all we can do. Just refuse to let go. Grace's chin trembled, but she did not cry. My papa used to say Mama was the stubbornest woman in 3 territories. Said once she set her mind to something heaven itself couldn't move her. Then remind her she's got something to be stubborn about. Ethan stood adjusting his gun belt out of habit. I'm leaving Dusty's water bucket by the door, and there's jerky in my saddlebag if you get hungry. Don't wait for me to eat. Mr. Cole, Grace's voice stopped him at the threshold. Why are you helping us? You don't even know us. Ethan turned back, and for a moment he saw not this cabin, but another one years ago and states away, and a different woman who had needed help he had been too proud to ask for until it was too late. The memory cut sharp and clean the way old wounds sometimes did. Maybe that's exactly why, he said finally. Because I don't know you, so I can't make the same mistakes twice. He did not wait for her response, just stepped out into the morning air and swung into the saddle. Dusty moved into an easy trot, then a canter, as Ethan pointed him northeast toward Willow Creek. The plains stretched endlessly around them, the grass still silvered with dew, the sky vast and cloudless overhead. As the cabin disappeared behind a rise, Ethan felt the familiar pull of the trail. That old instinct to just keep riding, to leave this complication behind, and return to the simple mathematics of survival that had sustained him for 3 years. No one would blame him. He had done more than most, would have more than those neighbors who had turned a desperate child away. He could ride into Willow Creek, tell someone about the sick woman and her daughter, leave it to people whose job it was to care, and be 10 miles gone before noon. The thought lasted maybe 30 seconds before shame burned it away. He had given his word to a 7-year-old girl who had already learned that most words were empty. That meant something, or it meant nothing at all. And if it meant nothing, then he had spent 3 years running from one failed promise, only to become the kind of man who made another one. Ethan urged Dusty faster. The buckskin responded with the smooth power of a horse bred for endurance, and the miles fell away beneath them. The sun climbed higher, warming his back. He passed a homestead where a man was already working. His field stopped at a creek to let Dusty drink and blow, then pushed on as the town of Willow Creek began to take shape on the horizon. It was not much of a town, maybe 40 buildings clustered along a single main street with a handful of houses scattered beyond. A church steeple rose at the far end, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. Signs identified a general store, a hotel, a saloon, a blacksmith. And there on the south side of the street stood a neat clapboard building with a shingle that read, Dr. William Harrison, physician and surgeon. Ethan pulled Dusty to a stop outside and dismounted, looping the reins over the hitching post. His legs protested after the hard ride, but he ignored the stiffness and climbed the 3 steps to the doctor's door. It was barely past 7 in the morning. He knocked once, waited, then knocked again harder. The door opened to reveal a man in his 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a collarless shirt and suspenders. His expression suggested he had been woken from sleep and was not pleased about it. Office hours start at 9, the doctor said curtly. Come back then. He started to close the door, but Ethan's boot wedged into the gap. I've got a woman dying 8 miles from here. She needs help now, not in 2 hours. Dr. Harrison's eyes narrowed, taking in the dust-covered stranger with the desperate edge in his voice. I'm not a charity operation, friend. My services cost money. $20 for a house call, plus treatment fees. Can you pay? I've got $43, Ethan said. And whatever that's not enough to cover, I'll work off. But this woman's been fevered for 3 days. She's got a 7-year-old daughter caring for her alone. And if we don't get to her soon, you won't need to worry about payment because there won't be anyone left to treat. The doctor's expression did not soften, but something shifted in his eyes, a calculation being made. Where's this woman located? Bennett Place. Hollow, about 2 miles west of the main trail, 8 miles southwest of here. Sarah Bennett. Dr. Harrison's mouth pressed into a thin line. I know who you're talking about. Widow woman lost her husband last winter. Been scraping by alone with her daughter ever since. Ethan's hand tightened on the doorframe. You know her situation, and you're standing here negotiating price. I know she's got no money, the doctor shot back. I know I made 2 house calls out there last year when her husband was dying, and I haven't seen payment for either one. I'm sympathetic, friend, but sympathy doesn't pay my bills or feed my family. She's dying, Ethan said flatly, and her daughter is watching it happen. If that doesn't move you, then I'll find someone it does move. There's no other doctor within 50 miles, but the doctor's tone had lost some of its hard edge. And I didn't say I wouldn't go. I said I needed to know about payment. Your $43 will cover the initial visit and basic treatment. If she needs medicine, surgery, extended care, that's extra. Fine. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather pouch, emptying it into his palm. $43 in mixed coins and crumpled bills, every cent he owned. He held it out. Take it, all of it. Just move, doctor. Harrison took the money with hands that showed the tremor of age or too much whiskey, counting it twice before nodding. Give me 10 minutes to gather supplies. There's a trough around back if your horse needs water. The door closed, leaving Ethan standing on the porch with empty pockets and a growing knot of anxiety in his chest. He led Dusty to the trough and let the buckskin drink while the sun climbed higher and people began emerging from houses, starting their daily routines. A woman sweeping her front steps paused to stare at him. 2 men heading toward the blacksmith's forge glanced his way and kept walking. Small town, Ethan thought. Everyone knows everyone else's business and strangers get noticed. Dr. Harrison emerged carrying a worn leather medical bag and a canvas sack that clinked with bottles. He had added a coat despite the warming day and carried himself with the brisk efficiency of a man who had made this kind of emergency call more times than he cared to count. I've got my own horse, he said, indicating a serviceable mare tied nearby. Follow me, and I hope for your sake this woman's condition is as serious as you claim, because I don't appreciate being dragged out at dawn for situations that could wait for office hours. You'll see soon enough, Ethan said. They rode in silence for the first mile the doctor mounted on his well-fed mare. As Willow Creek fell behind them, Dr. Harrison glanced over at Ethan with the assessing look doctors seem to develop alongside their medical skills. You're not from around here, he said. It was not quite a question. No, passing through. Family to Mrs. Bennett. Never met her before last night. Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose. Is that right? So what's your interest in all this? Her daughter found me on the trail, Ethan said. Asked for help. I helped. Noble of you. Nothing noble about it, just the only thing that made sense at the time. They rode another mile before the doctor spoke again. You know, I've practiced medicine for 30 years. Started in Philadelphia, came west after the war, thinking I'd make a difference out here on the frontier. He paused. And you know what I learned, that people are people no matter where you go. Some will bleed you dry, asking for help they don't need. Others will die before they'll ask for help they do need. Sarah Bennett is the second kind. That why nobody helped her yesterday when her daughter went asking. Dr. Harrison shook his head. The Swensons are struggling themselves. Lost half their cattle to disease last spring. The Coopers are good people, but they're 70 years old and barely managing their own place. It's not that folks don't care. It's that everyone out here is one bad season away from disaster. Helping your neighbor is noble until it means your own children go hungry. And which kind are you, doctor? The kind who helps or the kind who can't afford to? The doctor's jaw tightened. I'm the kind who shows up, friend, even when I don't get paid, even when it means riding 8 miles out of my way. So you can climb down off that moral high ground you're sitting on and recognize that maybe, just maybe, you're not the only person trying to do right in a situation with no good answers. The rebuke landed harder than Ethan wanted to admit. He had been so quick to judge, so ready to see everyone else's failure, that he had missed the simple truth. The doctor had come. Not happily, not quickly, but he had come. That counted for something. You're right, Ethan said after a moment. I apologize. They crested the rise and the hollow came into view below. In full daylight, the Bennett cabin looked even more desolate than it had the night before, a testament to stubborn survival against overwhelming odds. Smoke rose from the chimney, which Ethan took as a good sign. Grace was following instructions, keeping the fire going. How bad was she when you left? Dr. Harrison asked as they descended toward the cabin. Bad. High fever, delirious, barely conscious. I spent the night trying to cool her down with water. Got her to take a few sips here and there. She was still alive when I left at dawn, but that's about all I can tell you. 3 days fevered, you said, according to her daughter. Could be typhoid, could be pneumonia, could be a dozen other things. The doctor's professional demeanor had taken over his earlier irritation, replaced by focused concentration. The fact that she's lasted 3 days is actually promising. The ones that are going to die fast usually do it in the first 48 hours. They pulled up outside the cabin, and before Ethan could dismount, the door burst open and Grace came running out. Her face was transformed by relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. You came back, she breathed, stopping just short of grabbing Ethan's stirrup. You really came back. Told you I would. Ethan swung down and turned to Dr. Harrison, who was already gathering his bags. This is Grace Bennett. Grace, this is Dr. Harrison. He's going to help your mama. Grace's eyes went wide as she took in the doctor's presence, his official medical bag, the bottles clinking in his canvas sack. For a moment, she just stood there processing the reality that help had actually arrived. And then she did something that caught both men off guard. She burst into tears. Not the desperate crying of the day before, but the kind of weeping that comes when someone who has been holding themselves together by sheer woe finally feels safe enough to fall apart. Great heaving Shoya shook her thin-framed tears streaming down her face as 3 days of terror and loneliness and desperate responsibility finally broke through. Ethan knelt beside her, awkward and uncertain. Hey, now it's all right. The doctor's here. Your mama's going to be fine. I thought, Grace gasped between sobs, I thought nobody was coming. I thought she was going to die and it would be just me, and I didn't know what to do. But we are here, Ethan said firmly, and you did everything right. Everything. You kept her alive until help could come. That took more courage than most grown men have. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. The girl can cry after I've examined her mother. Right now, I need to get inside and assess the situation. Miss Grace, can you compose yourself enough to answer some questions? Grace wiped her eyes with her sleeve and nodded, sniffing hard. Yes, sir, I can do that. Good girl, lead the way. The cabin's interior smelled of smoke and sickness and the lingering dampness of the water Ethan had used through the night. Sarah lay exactly as he had left her, though someone, Grace presumably, had pulled the quilt higher and placed a fresh, damp cloth on her forehead. Dr. Harrison set his bags on the table and approached the bed with practiced movements. He pressed his fingers to Sarah's wrist, counting her pulse, then placed his hand on her forehead, her neck, her chest. Mrs. Bennett, he said loudly and clearly. Can you hear me? It's Dr. Harrison from Willow Creek. Sarah's eyes fluttered but did not open. A small sound escaped her lips, something between a moan and a word. She was talking this morning, Grace offered from the doorway. Not making much sense, but she knew I was here. She asked for water, and I gave her some, and she drank it. That's very good, the doctor said absently, his attention focused on his patient. He pulled back the quilt, examining Sarah's sweat-soaked dress, the way her chest rose and fell, the flush that colored her skin from forehead to collarbone. Ethan stood near the fireplace, feeling suddenly useless. This was the doctor's realm, now a world of diagnosis and treatments he knew nothing about. All he could do was wait and hope that his midnight ride had been fast enough. Dr. Harrison opened his medical bag and extracted a stethoscope, pressing it to Sarah's chest and listening intently. Then he examined her eyes, her tongue, her hands. The inspection took maybe 5 minutes, but felt like an hour. Finally, the doctor straightened and turned to face Grace and Ethan. "It's pneumonia," he said without preamble. "Both lungs are involved, which explains the high fever and delirium. She's also severely dehydrated, which is making everything worse." "Can you help her?" Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "I can try, but I need to be honest with you, child. Your mother is very sick." He paused, considering his words carefully. If this had gone on another day, maybe even another 12 hours, I don't think there would have been anything I could do. As it is, the next 24 hours will be critical. "But she's going to live," Grace pressed. "You can make her live." Dr. Harrison's expression softened slightly. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she does. But I can't make you promises I might not be able to keep. What I can tell you is that she's got a fighting chance now, and she didn't have that yesterday. Do you understand?" Grace nodded, though her face had gone pale. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the fine tremor that ran through her. "What do you need?" he asked the doctor. "Hot water, clean cloths, somewhere to work. And I'm going to need both of you out of the cabin for about an hour while I examine her properly and get her into clean clothes. Can you manage that?" Ethan nodded. "Come on, Grace. Let's give the doctor room to work." They stepped outside into the morning sun, which had climbed high enough now to banish the last cool shadows. Ethan led Grace to a fallen log near the empty lean-to, and they sat the girl tucked against his side like she had been doing it all her life. "Is he really going to save her?" Grace asked quietly. "He's going to try his best," Ethan said. "That's all any of us can do." What if his best isn't enough? The question deserved honesty, even though honesty was a hard thing to give a 7-year-old who had already lost so much. Ethan took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "Then we'll deal with that if it comes. But right now, your mama's got something she didn't have 12 hours ago. She's got a doctor who knows what he's doing. She's got medicine. She's got help." "Those are good odds, Grace, better than most people get out here." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun track across the sky. Eventually, Grace spoke again, her voice small. "Mr. Cole, after Mama gets better, are you going to leave?" The question struck at something Ethan had been avoiding thinking about since dawn. Of course he was going to leave. That's what he did. That's what he had been doing for 3 years. He had never intended to stop, never planned to put down roots or make connections or become the kind of man people relied on. But sitting there with this child pressed against his side in the yard of a cabin that represented stubborn survival against impossible odds, looking at his empty pockets and thinking about the promise he had made, Ethan realized that leaving was not quite as simple as it used to be. "I don't know," he said finally. "Haven't thought that far ahead. Mama's going to need help when she's better," Grace said with the careful tone of someone making a case they knew was fragile. "She can't work the place alone, and I'm too small to do much. And you said you'd work off what the doctor costs, so maybe you could stay at least for a little while, just until Mama's strong again." Every instinct Ethan had developed over 3 years of drifting screamed at him to shut this down immediately, to make it clear he had done his part and owed nothing more to protect himself from the kind of entanglement that could only end badly. But he looked at Grace's hopeful face, at this child who had watched her father die and nearly lost her mother and been turned away by neighbors who should have helped, and he could not bring himself to take away the small hope that had kindled in her eyes. "We'll see," he said instead. "Let's get your mama well first, then worry about what comes after." It was not a promise, but it was not a refusal either. Grace seemed to understand the distinction because she nodded and leaned harder against him, a small gesture of trust that felt heavier than any burden Ethan had ever carried. Dr. Harrison emerged after what felt like hours, but was probably closer to one, rolling down his sleeves and looking tired, but not defeated. "You can come in now," he said. I've done what I can for the immediate crisis. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Sarah still lay in bed, but now dressed in a clean nightgown, her hair brushed back from her face, her skin looking less alarmingly flushed than before. The cabin had been aired out, the sick smell replaced by the sharp scent of camphor and something else medicinal. Clean cloths sat in neat stacks on the table beside several dark bottles. She's sleeping naturally now, Dr. Harrison explained, which is what she needs most. I've administered willow bark for the fever and a tincture for her lungs. She needs water, constantly small sips every time she wakes. And she needs to be kept cool, but not cold. That means damp cloths regularly, but also making sure she stays covered so she doesn't catch a chill. He pulled out a small dark bottle from his bag. This is laudanum for pain and to help her rest. 2 drops in water 3 times a day. No more. Too much and it will suppress her breathing, which is the last thing we want. Can you measure 2 drops? Grace took the bottle carefully and counted out exactly 2 drops into the tin cup, her small face serious with concentration. Perfect. The doctor pulled out a folded paper covered in neat handwriting. Now I'm leaving this bottle along with the fever tincture and the lung medicine. I've written instructions for each one. Can you read? Yes, sir, Mama taught me. Excellent. Follow these instructions exactly. No more, no less. I'll come back tomorrow to check on her progress. If she takes a turn for the worse before then, if she starts bleeding from the mouth or nose, if her breathing becomes labored to the point she can't speak, if the fever spikes again, despite the medicine you send for me immediately. Understand? Grace's hands trembled slightly as she took the paper. Yes, sir. Dr. Harrison turned to Ethan. You'll be staying. It was not really a question. All 3 of them looked at Ethan, and he found himself backed into a corner he had been trying to avoid since Grace first asked him to stay. He could leave. Nothing bound him here except a child's hope and a woman's unspoken need, and his own inconvenient sense that walking away now would make him exactly the kind of man he had spent 3 years trying not to become. I'll stay through harvest, he heard himself say. Make sure the cabin's sound for winter. Get the heavy work done. After that, we'll see. Sarah's voice, weak but clear, startled everyone. Mr. Cole, I told you I can't pay. Ethan's voice came out sharper than he intended, frustration at his own capitulation bleeding through. And I told you I don't want your money. Consider it working off the doctor's fee or whatever story lets you accept help without killing your pride. But the fact is you need assistance, and I'm here and I don't have anywhere more important to be. So that's how it is. A heavy silence followed his words. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Through harvest, then we reassess. Agreed. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat, apparently satisfied that the adults had reached some kind of agreement. He adjusted Sarah's medication schedule, left additional medicine, and refused payment with a brusque statement about investing in future business. After he left, an awkward silence settled over the cabin. Ethan busied himself with the fire while Grace fussed over her mother's pillows. Sarah lay propped up, clearly wrestling with the reality of her situation. Finally, she spoke. Grace, sweetheart, could you fetch water from the rain barrel? I'd like to wash my face. It was obviously a manufactured errand, a way to get the child outside so the adults could talk. Grace glanced between them, then nodded and grabbed the bucket, closing the door quietly behind her. Sarah waited until the sound of footsteps faded. You don't know me, Mr. Cole. Don't owe me anything. So why would you stay? Ethan considered several answers, discarding each as too revealing or not true enough. Finally, he settled on honesty, or at least the closest he could come to it. 3 years ago, I had a wife, he said. We lived in Missouri. Small farm, barely scraping by, but making it work. She got pregnant, and I was so damn proud. So sure I was going to give my family everything they needed. He paused, the words harder to say than he had expected. But I was also too proud to ask for help when we needed it. Too stubborn to admit when things were falling apart. When she went into labor early and things went wrong, I was 10 miles away, trying to earn extra money instead of being home where I belonged. By the time I got back, I'd lost them both, my wife and the child I never got to meet. Sarah's expression softened with recognition, the kind that came from knowing grief personally. I'm sorry. Not telling you for sympathy, Ethan said. Telling you because I understand what it's like to be too proud to accept help until it's too late. And your daughter shouldn't lose her mother just because you inherited the same stubborn streak that cost me everything. He met her eyes steadily. So I'm staying not as charity, not as pity, but because maybe if I can help one family not fall apart, it means something. It means the last 3 years of running and pretending nothing matters weren't completely wasted. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her fingers plucking at the quilt. When she spoke, her voice was thick. My husband built this cabin with his own hands. Every loan, every nail. Had dreams for this place. Cattle crops, maybe building it up into something we could pass down to Grace and whatever other children that came along. Then one moment of bad luck, and he was gone. She paused. I've been holding on by my fingernails ever since, trying to honor what he built, trying to prove I could manage alone, because admitting I couldn't felt like admitting he died for nothing. He didn't die for nothing, Ethan said quietly. He left you and Grace a home, a foundation. But foundations are meant to be built on. Sometimes that takes more than one person. Accepting help doesn't dishonor his memory. It means you're practical enough to recognize what you need to survive. The door opened and Grace returned with the water. Sarah looked at her daughter, then at Ethan. There's something I need to tell you. A complication. When James died, he owed the Swensons money. $150 that James borrowed 2 years ago to buy seed and equipment. James was going to pay them back from last harvest, but the accident happened before we could sell crops. I managed to pay them $30 from selling his tools, but I still owe $120. Grace added quietly, Mr. Swenson came by last month. He wasn't nice, Mama. Sarah's face tightened. Lars said they needed the money by spring, or they'd have to explore other options. He looked at the cabin when he said it. The stakes had suddenly risen exponentially. Through harvest now meant through a confrontation with creditors who could take everything. Ethan's commitment had become far more complicated than a simple matter of helping a widow recover from illness. But his voice remained steady. Then we'll figure it out, one problem at a time. First get you well, then make it through winter. Come spring, we'll deal with the Swensons. The days that followed fell into a rhythm defined by recovery and quiet work. Ethan moved through a mental list of repairs the homestead needed, securing loose boards, reinforcing door hinges, checking the chimney for obstructions. Sarah grew stronger, incrementally, able to sit at the table for meals and move around the cabin for short periods, though any exertion beyond the basics left her breathless. Grace relaxed considerably, the constant fear finally lifting from her thin shoulders, and she started laughing again, a sound that had been noticeably absent. One afternoon, while Ethan repaired a section of fence near the garden, Grace helped him with the bag of nails. How come you know how to fix so many things? She asked. Picked it up here and there, Ethan said, hammering in another nail. Work cattle drives and odd jobs across 6 territories. You learn what you need to survive. Can't always hire someone to fix your problems, so you figure out how to do it yourself. Did your papa teach you some? He was a wheelwright back in Ohio, so I grew up around tools and wood. But most of what I know came from watching other men work and not being afraid to try things, even when I wasn't sure I'd get them right. Grace tested the fence rail, nodding approvingly when it held firm. Papa used to say failure was just learning in disguise. Said you couldn't get good at anything without messing it up a few times first. Your papa was right about that. Ethan moved to the next broken section. What else did he teach you? The list was long, reading figuring numbers, which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick. He had been teaching her to ride before he died, but they had only had one horse, and Sarah had sold her after to buy food for winter. Grace's voice dropped. I miss riding, miss feeling like I could go anywhere if I needed to. The longing in her words struck something in Ethan's chest. He understood that yearning for freedom, that desire to have the option of leaving even if you never took it. It was part of why he had spent 3 years drifting, convincing himself that movement equaled choice. Tell you what, he said, straightening from his work. Dusty's gentle enough for a beginner. If you're interested, I could teach you to ride proper. Not just sit a saddle, but really ride. Grace's face lit up like sunrise. Really, you mean it? I mean it. We'll start this afternoon if your mama approves. They finished the fence work and returned to the cabin to find Sarah attempting to knead bread dough. Her movements were slow and clumsy, frustration evident in every line of her body. She looked up when they entered, and Ethan saw the sheen of sweat on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Let me do that," he said, crossing to the table and gently taking over. His hands found the rhythm easily, the push and fold motions, something he had learned from his own mother years ago. "You're supposed to be resting, not wearing yourself out with heavy work." "I can't just lie in bed forever," Sarah protested, but she sank into the chair with visible relief. "I need to pull my weight around here." "You will when you're stronger. Right now your job is to heal." Ethan shaped the dough into a rough ball and set it in the bowl to rise. "Besides, Grace and I make a decent team. We've got things covered." "That's what worries me," Sarah said quietly. "You two getting comfortable with me being useless." Grace moved to her mother's side immediately. "You're not useless, Mama. You're sick. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, Mr. Cole has taken over running my household, and I've become nothing but an invalid who can't even make bread without collapsing." The bitterness in her voice made Ethan pause. He wiped flour from his hands and turned to face her directly. "Mrs. Bennett, you spent months keeping this place going alone while grieving your husband and raising a child. You survived a winter that would have broken most people. And when sickness nearly killed you, you still managed to raise a daughter brave enough to keep searching for help until she found it. None of that is useless. None of that disappears just because you need assistance right now." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "It feels like failure. It feels like being human. We all need help sometimes. The strong thing is accepting it, not pretending you don't need it until it's too late." The words hung in the air, and Ethan realized he was preaching wisdom he had never managed to practice himself. He had spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of interdependence, convinced that needing nothing from anyone was the same as being strong. But sitting here in this cabin, watching a woman struggle with the same pride that had cost him everything, he began to understand that maybe strength looked different than he had thought. "Mr. Cole asked if he could teach me to ride," Grace interjected, clearly trying to shift the mood. "I said I had to ask you first." Sarah looked between them, and slowly her expression softened. "Your father would have liked that. He always said everyone should know how to ride." "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes, but you listen to Mr. Cole's instructions and you don't take foolish risks just to show off." "I won't, I promise." That afternoon, Ethan saddled Dusty in the lean-to, while Grace practically vibrated with excitement beside him. The buckskin seemed to sense her energy and stood perfectly still, ears forward, but body relaxed in the way of horses who understood their job. "First rule," Ethan said as he checked the cinch one final time. "The horse is bigger and stronger than you, but you're smarter. Your job is to communicate clearly what you want and to listen to what the horse is telling you back. Riding isn't about domination. It's about partnership." He spent an hour teaching her the basics, walking beside Dusty, while Grace learned to feel the horse's movement beneath her to move with it rather than fighting against it. She was a natural, her body finding the rhythm instinctively, her hands gentle on the reins. By the time the lesson ended, she was beaming with pride, and Dusty was looking pleased with himself in the way horses did when they had been good. "Can we do this every day?" Grace asked as Ethan lifted her down. "Every day the weather permits. And once you've got the basics solid, we'll work on more advanced skills. By spring, you'll be riding well enough to help with real work." "You really think so?" "I know so. You've got good instincts and you're not afraid. Those are the two most important things." Sarah was standing in the doorway watching, and when their eyes met, Ethan saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not quite gratitude, not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of both. It terrified him more than he wanted to admit. As autumn deepened, Ethan worked with increasing urgency, knowing that once the snows came, certain repairs would become impossible. He reinforced the cabin's foundation, replaced rotted wood in the lean-to, and spent 2 full days on the roof making sure every shingle was secure and every potential leak sealed. One evening, as they sat around the table after supper, Sarah pulled out a worn ledger and opened it to a page covered in careful figures. "I've been doing calculations," she said without preamble. "Winter supplies, what we have versus what we need. It's not good." Ethan leaned over to look at the numbers. She had listed everything: flour, cornmeal, salt, coffee, sugar, dry beans, salt pork. The quantities on hand were pitifully small. The quantities needed significantly larger. "How much money do we have to work with?" He asked, the word "we" slipping out naturally. $17. The three I'd saved, plus what I got from selling some of James's tools to the blacksmith in town. It's not enough, not nearly enough to buy what we need and still have anything left for emergencies. Grace looked between them, fear creeping back into her expression. Are we going to starve? No, Ethan said firmly. We're not going to starve, but we need to be smart about this. He studied the list again, his mind working through possibilities. The garden still has some late vegetables we can harvest and store. And there's game in these hills. Deer, rabbit, maybe even elk if we're lucky. I can hunt lay-in meat for winter. That'll stretch the money further. Do you know how to preserve meat? Sarah asked. I've seen it done. Salt, cure, smoke, dry it into jerky. I can figure it out. I know how, Sarah said quietly. James and I did it every year. I can teach you, and Grace can help. It'll give me something useful to do. Over the next week, they fell into a new rhythm, organized around preparation and preservation. Ethan borrowed a rifle from Dr. Harrison, promising to repay him in labor come spring, and spent his mornings hunting the ridges above the hollow. He brought down 2 deer and countless rabbits, and each evening they worked together processing the meat, Sarah directing, while Grace and Ethan did the physical labor. The cabin filled with the smell of wood smoke and curing meat, and something shifted in their dynamic during those shared tasks. They talked while they worked, not about anything important, but about small things. Memories of better times, observations about the weather, stories from their different pasts. One evening while rubbing salt into strips of venison, Sarah said, "We met in Independence. I was there with my father buying supplies for his dry goods store back in Illinois. James was passing through, heading west to find land and opportunity. We talked for maybe 20 minutes at the general store, and I knew." She smiled at the memory. "I just knew he was going to be important." "What did your father think about you running off with a stranger heading west?" Ethan asked. "He was furious. Said I was throwing away my life, that I'd end up widowed and destitute in some godforsaken territory." Her smile turned sad. "He wasn't entirely wrong as it turned out. But you don't regret it. Not for a moment. The years I had with James, the life we built, the daughter we made, those were worth every hardship that came after." She paused in her work, looking at Grace, who was carefully arranging strips of meat on the smoking rack. "Sometimes the best things in life require the biggest risks." The words seemed aimed at more than just her own history, and Ethan felt the weight of implication, but he chose not to examine it too closely. Instead, he focused on the work, on the practical steps required to ensure their survival, on the comfortable silence that fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and Grace's occasional questions. By mid-October, they had laid in a reasonable store of preserved meat and harvested the last of the garden's yield. Ethan built crude shelves in the coolest corner of the cabin to store root vegetables and created a covered pit outside for additional storage. It was not abundance, but it was enough. They would make it through winter if they were careful and if luck held. The first snow came early one morning, surprising them with its suddenness. Ethan woke to find the world outside transformed, the hollow covered in a blanket of white that softened every hard edge and made the familiar landscape strange and beautiful. Grace's delighted cry when she saw it brought both adults to the window, and they stood watching as fat flakes continued to fall, accumulating in drifts against the cabin walls. "I love the first snow," Grace said, her breath fogging the glass. "Papa always said it was the land putting on its winter blanket, getting ready for the long sleep." "Your papa had a way with words," Ethan observed. "He did. Mama says I take after him that way." She turned from the window, her expression suddenly serious. "Mr. Cole, are you glad you stayed? Or do you wish you'd kept riding that day I found you?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. Sarah was watching from the table where she had been mending a shirt, her needle paused mid-stitch, clearly as interested in his answer as her daughter. Ethan considered lying, offering some platitude about being happy to help or doing what needed to be done, but these two had earned honesty from him even when honesty was uncomfortable. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "Some days I wake up and wonder what I've gotten myself into, how I went from passing stranger to someone building shelves and hunting deer and teaching a little girl to ride. It's not what I planned. It's not what I thought I wanted." Grace's face fell slightly, but Ethan continued. "But then there are moments, usually small ones, like when we're working together and everything just flows, or when I see your mama laughing again, or when you land a perfect transition on Dusty. And in those moments, I think maybe staying was the smartest thing I've done in 3 years. Maybe the only smart thing. So you are glad, Grace pressed, needing certainty. I'm getting there, Ethan said, which was as close to the truth as he could manage. Still figuring it out, but I'm getting there. The answer seemed to satisfy her, and she returned her attention to the falling snow, already planning all the things they could do once enough accumulated. Sarah met Ethan's eyes across the cabin and nodded slightly, a gesture of understanding that needed no words. That night, after Grace had fallen asleep and Sarah was dozing in her bed, Ethan sat by the fire and allowed himself to think about the future for the first time in years. Not in terms of escape routes or exit strategies, but in terms of possibility. Spring planting, expanding the garden, maybe buying a cow or some chickens. Small ambitions, domestic ones, the kind he had fled from after Missouri. The difference he realized was that this time he was not building something alone. Whatever happened in this cabin, whatever they created together, it would be shared work, shared risk, shared reward. He would not have to carry the burden of providing for a family by himself, while his pride prevented him from asking for help when he needed it. Sarah and Grace were partners in survival, not dependence, waiting to be rescued. That distinction mattered more than he had understood until now. Winter settled in with the kind of cold that made every breath visible and every movement outside a calculated decision about necessity versus comfort. They burned through wood at a steady rate, and Ethan found himself grateful for the hours he had spent in autumn, chopping and stacking building reserves that now seemed barely adequate. During a particularly fierce storm that kept them cabin-bound for 3 days straight, Sarah pulled out the worn copy of Robinson Crusoe and suggested they take turns reading aloud. It became their evening ritual, gathering close to the fire while one person read and the others listened. The story of a man surviving alone on an island resonated perhaps more than it should have. "Do you think he was lonely?" Grace asked one night during a break in the reading. "Even with Friday there, do you think he missed having more people around?" "I think loneliness isn't always about how many people are present," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. And sometimes one or two people who really understand you is more than enough." Her eyes met Ethan's briefly, and he wondered if she was still talking about Crusoe or if the conversation had shifted to something more immediate, more personal. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "that Crusoe had to learn that surviving wasn't the same as living. That maybe the island wasn't his prison. His refusal to accept help and build real connections was." Sarah's expression suggested she heard what he was not quite saying directly, and her small smile felt like acknowledgement of growth he had not been sure she had noticed. The storm broke on the third morning, and Ethan knew he needed to check on Dusty in the lean-to and replenish their dwindling wood supply. He stepped outside into brutal cold snow, drifted higher than expected. He made his way to the woodpile and began chopping, but the axe felt different. The handle gave slightly under his grip. Then came the crack. The handle split almost completely through, and Ethan stared at it with rising concern. They could not afford a new handle. Without an axe, they could not cut wood. Without wood, they would freeze. The mathematics of frontier survival were brutally simple. He returned to the cabin with the broken axe, showing it to Sarah. She examined the damage with an assessing look, the same look James probably had worn when facing similar crises. "James had a spare handle in the lean-to," she said finally. "Back corner. There's a bundle of long handles he'd shaped but never finished." Ethan found them exactly where she said, covered in dust and cobwebs, but perfectly serviceable. As he fitted the new handle and secured it, he felt a strange gratitude toward the dead man, whose foresight was still protecting his family months after his death. James Bennett had thought ahead, planned for contingencies, built reserves against disaster. These were the actions of a man who understood that survival was not about strength, but about preparation and persistence. Ethan had spent 3 years just surviving day to day, moving before problems could accumulate, avoiding commitment because commitment meant vulnerability. But James had chosen the harder path, planting roots, building something that could outlast him, creating a legacy in wood and stone, and the family he had loved. Looking around the cabin with its solid walls and careful craftsmanship, Ethan began to understand which approach actually required more courage. The old man's voice faded into the evening air, and William sat silent, processing everything he had heard. The Montana night had deepened around them, stars brilliant in the vast darkness overhead. "James's spare handle saved you," William said finally. A man you never met who died before you arrived, still protecting his family through what he'd built. Ethan nodded. That's what legacy means, William. Not grand gestures or wealth passed down, but small preparations made with care. Things you build to outlast you. Choices you make thinking about people who will come after. He leaned back in his chair. Your father, my son, James Thomas, named after the man who taught me that lesson. He carries that name because I wanted him to remember that being a man isn't about never needing help. It's about building something solid enough that even when you're gone, it stands. William was quiet, understanding his grandfather's lesson applying to his own journey. When I head west tomorrow, I'll be building my own foundation. You will. And there'll be times you're tempted to do it all alone to prove you don't need anyone. Ethan's voice was firm. Don't. Build with others. Accept help. Offer it freely. That's how you create something that lasts. He paused, then continued, but I'm still not done with the story. That winter taught me about survival. But spring taught me something even harder, about love and loss and learning to risk your heart again. By late January, something had shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. The brutal cold that had defined December began to ease slightly, though winter still held the Montana plains in its grip. Sarah had regained most of her strength, moving through the cabin with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had reclaimed her domain. She no longer watched from the sidelines as Ethan worked. Instead, she stood beside him, kneading bread, while he repaired harnesses, discussing spring planting plans, while Grace practiced her letters at the table. The careful distance they had maintained began to dissolve in ways both small and significant. Sarah's hand would rest on Ethan's shoulder as she passed behind his chair. He would pour her coffee without asking, knowing exactly how she took it. They had developed a dozen small routines that spoke of familiarity and trust, the kind of intimacy that grew not from grand gestures, but from the accumulation of ordinary moments. Grace watched these developments with barely concealed satisfaction, her knowing glances between the two adults, suggesting she saw exactly where things were heading, even if they had not acknowledged it themselves. One evening in late January, after Grace had gone to bed, Sarah and Ethan sat at the table working on plans for spring planting. Their heads were close together over the rough sketches Sarah had drawn, and Ethan was acutely aware of her proximity. The smell of soap and wood smoke in her hair, the way her shoulder brushed his when she leaned forward to point at something on the paper. We should expand the garden here, Sarah said, indicating the southern edge of their current plot. More sun exposure, better drainage. James always meant to, but never got around to it. Makes sense, Ethan said. If we do well enough with crops, we might have surplus to trade in town for things we can't grow or make ourselves. That's ambitious. Sarah looked up and suddenly her face was very close to his, maybe 6 inches away. Close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, the slight flush that colored her cheeks. I like it. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The air between them seemed charged with something Ethan had been trying not to name, something that terrified and attracted him in equal measure. Then Sarah pulled back slightly, clearing her throat. We should probably think about seeds soon, she said, before demand drives prices up. Right. Seeds. Ethan forced himself to focus on the paper in front of him. I could ride into Willow Creek next week if the weather holds. They returned to planning, but something had changed. Some invisible line had been approached, if not crossed. Later, lying in his bed in the dark, Ethan found himself thinking not about spring planting, but about the possibility of futures that extended beyond mere survival. Futures that might include not just partnership, but something deeper. He had come to this cabin 6 months ago to help a desperate child and a dying mother, never intending to stay, never imagining he would find himself here, building a life he had thought lost forever. But intentions did not matter much in the face of reality. And the reality was that he had stopped thinking of this as temporary accommodation and started thinking of it as home. The question was no longer whether to stay. That decision had been made and remade 100 times through his actions, rather than words. The question now was what staying meant and whether he had the courage to risk his heart again after spending 3 years protecting it. The morning after that planning session was cold and clear, the kind of day that promised brutal temperatures but at least offered visibility. Ethan was feeding Dusty in the lean-to when Sarah appeared in the doorway, wrapped in James's old coat that still hung too large on her frame. I wanted to talk to you, she said without preamble, without Grace listening. Ethan set down the feed bucket, his stomach tightening. All right. Sarah moved closer, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Last night at the table, that moment, I need to know if I imagined it or if you felt it too. The directness caught him off guard. He had expected avoidance, polite pretense that nothing had happened. Instead, she was confronting it head-on with the same practical courage she brought to every other challenge. You didn't imagine it, he said quietly. Sarah visibly relaxed. Good, because I've been going slowly crazy, thinking maybe I was projecting, seeing things that weren't there because I'm lonely and grateful and you've been so good to us. She pulled the coat tighter around herself. But if you felt it too, then we need to talk about what happens next. Ethan's deflection died before he could voice it. Can't we just what, ignore it? Pretend, Sarah shook her head. I tried that approach before, it didn't work. She took a breath and Ethan saw her gathering herself for something difficult. I loved my husband, loved him with everything I had. Losing him nearly destroyed me. For months after he died, I couldn't imagine ever feeling that way about anyone else. It seemed impossible, disloyal somehow. Ethan started to speak, but she held up a hand. Let me finish. But these past months with you, I've learned something. Love isn't a finite resource. The love I had for James doesn't disappear just because I'm capable of feeling something for someone else. And James would never have wanted me to spend the rest of my life alone just to prove I'd loved him enough. Sarah, Ethan's throat felt tight. I'm saying that somewhere between you arriving as a stranger and now you became essential, she continued, her eyes meeting his directly. Not just because you work hard or because you've kept us alive through winter, but because you listen when I talk, because you treat Grace like she matters, because you're patient with my pride and my grief and my stubborn refusal to accept help even when I desperately need it. She paused. I'm saying I have feelings for you, Ethan Cole, and I needed you to know that before another day passed with us dancing around it and pretending otherwise. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Ethan thought he understood about their arrangement. He had told himself he was here, out of obligation, out of debt, to a child who had asked for help. But standing in this lean-to with Sarah looking at him like he was something precious and unexpected, he had to confront the truth he had been avoiding for weeks. I'm terrified, he said finally, of caring that much again, of building something and watching it fall apart. I already failed one family, Sarah. What if I fail yours too? You won't, Sarah said firmly. You can't know that. No, I can't. But I do know you're already here, already part of this family, whether you've admitted it or not. Her voice softened. The question isn't whether you'll fail us. The question is whether you'll let fear keep you from having something real, just because there's a chance it might hurt. Ethan thought about Emma, about the guilt he had carried for 3 years, about all the ways he had convinced himself that staying distant was safer than risking connection. Then he thought about Grace's drawings, about winter evenings by the fire, about the accumulation of small moments that had rebuilt something inside him he had thought permanently broken. I'm not good at this, he admitted, at being vulnerable, at trusting that good things can last. Sarah moved closer. Then we'll learn together, because I'm not particularly good at it either anymore. But I think we owe it to ourselves to treat boy. Don't you? Before he could answer, before he could overthink and second-guess and retreat into the comfortable safety of isolation, Ethan closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was awkward at first, hesitant, both of them out of practice and uncertain. But then Sarah's hands came up to frame his face, and something shifted. The kiss deepened into something that felt like promise and possibility and the beginning of healing. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sarah was smiling. So I'm taking that as a yes. That's a yes, Ethan confirmed, and felt something in his chest ease, some burden he had been carrying, finally set down. They returned to the cabin to find Grace watching them with knowing eyes and a satisfied expression that suggested she had orchestrated this outcome through sheer force of will. Finally, she said, I was starting to think you two would never figure it out. Figure what out? Sarah asked, trying for innocent and failing completely. Grace crossed her arms with 7-year-old certainty. That you like each other, that Mr. Cole should stay forever, not just through winter, that we're supposed to be a real family. It was pretty obvious to everyone except you two. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances caught between amusement and chagrin at being so transparent to a child. Nothing's decided yet, Sarah cautioned. This is all very new and complicated. It's not complicated, Grace said with the directness of youth. Do you love him? Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she did not look away from her daughter. I think I could. I think I'm already starting to. And Mr. Cole, do you love Mama? Ethan felt three pairs of eyes on him. Sarah's carefully neutral graces, expectant, and even Dusty seemed to be peering through the lean-to wall with judgment. Love felt like too big a word, too weighted with history and failure. But as he stood there searching for the right answer, he realized that what he felt was already more than he had allowed himself to feel in 3 years. I care about your mother very much, he said carefully, and about you. This family has come to mean more to me than I knew how to admit until recently. So if what you're asking is whether I plan to stay and see where this goes, then yes, I'm staying. Grace launched herself at him with enough force to nearly knock him over, her thin arms wrapping around his waist in a fierce hug. I knew it. I knew you wouldn't leave us. Over her head, Ethan met Sarah's eyes and saw his own wonder reflected back. They had both thought their chances at happiness were finished, that the best they could hope for was survival and perhaps peace. But standing here in this cabin with winter still howling outside and spring months away, they had found something neither expected. The possibility of beginning again. The weeks that followed were marked by a tentative joy that none of them quite knew how to name. Ethan continued his work on the homestead, but now Sarah worked beside him more often, their conversations ranging from practical matters to deeper subjects they had both avoided before. Grace flourished under the stability, her laughter ringing through the cabin with increasing frequency. One evening in late April, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of crimson and gold, Grace asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for weeks. Mr. Cole, are you going to marry Mama? Sarah choked on her coffee while Ethan froze mid-motion. Both of them caught completely off guard by the child's directness. Why? Grace pressed with relentless logic. You love her? She loves you. We're already a family. Seems pretty simple to me. Sarah found her voice first. Marriage is a serious commitment, sweetheart, not something to rush into just because it seems convenient or logical. But you do want to marry him, don't you? Or are you just going to live together forever without making it official? Because people in town are already talking. Mrs. Swenson told me at church that it wasn't proper for a man and woman to share a household without being married unless they're family. Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances over Grace's head. They had been so focused on getting through each day, on building trust and allowing feelings to develop naturally, that neither had wanted to rush toward formal commitments that might jinx their fragile new beginning. But Grace was right. They could not exist in this liminal space forever, not without consequences for all of them. Would you want that? Ethan asked Sarah quietly. Marriage, Mehan, making this permanent and official. Sarah took a long moment before answering, her eyes distant, as she seemed to consult with ghosts only she could see. Then she turned to face him fully, her expression clear and certain. Yes, she said simply, I would want that. Not because the town expects it, or because it's the proper thing, but because I love you and I want to build a real life with you. And I want Grace to grow up in a household where commitment means something. Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he was sure both of them could hear it. This was the moment he had been both hoping for and dreading, the point where running was no longer an option, and he had to decide whether he trusted himself enough to try again. He thought about Emma, about the ways his pride and fear had destroyed what they had built. He thought about the 3 years he had spent drifting, convinced he had used up his chance at family. And he thought about this cabin, these two people, and the man he had slowly become under their influence. Someone stronger, braver, more capable of love than the broken drifter who had stopped because a child asked him to. I don't have a ring, he said, which was not an answer, but also was. And I'm still figuring out how to be the kind of man who deserves a second chance. But if you'll have me, if you'll both have me, then yes, I want to marry you, Sarah Bennett. I want to make this official and permanent and real. Grace whooped with delight, loud enough to startle birds from nearby trees. Sarah was crying and smiling simultaneously, and when Ethan pulled her close, she melted into him with the kind of trust that felt like the most precious gift he had ever received. "We'll do it properly," Sarah said when she could speak. "In town with witnesses. So everyone knows this is real. So there's no question about our commitment or your place in this family." 3 weeks later, they stood in Willow Creek's small church with Dr. Harrison serving as witness and Grace as the world's proudest attendant. Sarah wore a simple dress she had sewn herself from fabric bought with egg-out money. Ethan wore his cleanest shirt and a tie borrowed from the blacksmith. It was not fancy or elaborate, but when they stood before the circuit preacher and spoke their vows, the weight of the moment felt as real and binding as any ceremony in the grandest cathedral. "I promise to stand beside you in good times and hard times." Ethan said the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "In prosperity and want. I promise to listen when you need to be heard and to ask for help when I need it. I promise to honor your strength and to remember always that we're partners in this life. Not savior and saved, but two people building something together." Sarah's vows echoed his commitment, promising partnership and honesty and the courage to keep choosing each other even when it was difficult. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like forgiveness and hope, and the beginning of a story neither had thought they would get to write. The townspeople who had heard about the wedding, which turned out to be more than expected, had organized a modest celebration at the hotel. The Swensons were there looking somewhat ashamed as they congratulated the couple and promised to be better neighbors going forward. The Coopers brought a wedding cake they had baked, apologizing for their earlier coldness. Even the general store owner made an appearance, clearly pleased that his occasional extension of credit was looking more secure with every passing day. But the celebration was interrupted when Lars Swenson pulled Ethan aside away from the gathered crowd. His expression was grave, and Ethan felt his jaw tighten in anticipation of trouble. "Cole, we need to talk about the debt," Lars said quietly. "I know you and Sarah just married, and I hate to bring this up now, but spring's here and I still need that $120. My family's in a bad way. Ingrid's sick, needs a doctor. The kids are going hungry. If I don't get the money or equivalent by month's end, I'll have no choice but to file a claim." Ethan's mind raced. They did not have $120. They had barely scraped together money for the wedding. Spring planting had not even started yet. They would not have a harvest to sell for months. The cabin that Sarah's husband had built with his own hands, the home that had become Ethan's sanctuary, could be taken away because of a debt incurred years before he had arrived. But then Grace appeared, having been watching from the doorway. Her face was pale but determined, and she held something in her hands. A small wooden box. "Mr. Swenson, wait," she said, stepping forward. She opened the box to reveal a stack of bills and coins. This was Papa's emergency money. Mama didn't know about it. He showed me where he hid it, in a false bottom of his tool chest. He said it was for, if something happened to him, for Mama and me to start over if we needed. She counted it out carefully. $85. Papa was good at saving. She held the money toward Lars. "This pays what we owe, plus interest for waiting." Everyone stood frozen. Sarah's hand covered her mouth, clearly having had no knowledge of the hidden money. Ethan stared at Grace, at this brave, practical child who had just saved their home. Lars looked at the money like it was both salvation and shame. He reached for it slowly, his hand shaking. "Grace, your father was a good man, better than me." He took the money with trembling fingers. "This clears the debt, in full. And I'm sorry for everything, for turning you away when you needed help, for threatening your home, for—" His voice broke, but Grace interrupted. "Papa used to say everyone does their best, even when their best isn't very good. He said forgiving people was how you kept from going bitter." She extended her small hand. "So I forgive you, Mr. Swenson, and I hope Mrs. Swenson gets better." Lars took her hand and shook it like she was a grown woman, not a 7-year-old child. "Thank you, Miss Bennett." He looked at Sarah and Ethan. "You've raised a remarkable daughter. James would be proud." After Lars left, Sarah knelt before Grace. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell me about that money?" Grace's wisdom seemed beyond her years. "Papa said I'd know when it was the right time. Said sometimes you have to trust people with your safety before they can really be family." She looked at Ethan. "I trust Pa now. He's earned it." It was the first time she had called him Pa instead of Mr. Cole, and Ethan found his throat too tight for words. He knelt beside his wife and pulled both of them into an embrace standing in the street outside the hotel in Willow Creek. This family he had stumbled into, this family he had chosen, this family he would fight for with everything he had. Summer passed in purposeful work. The crops grew strong and healthy, the garden overflowed with vegetables, and the chicken coop Ethan had built filled with hens that provided eggs for eating and selling. They worked from dawn to dusk, but it was work that felt meaningful rather than desperate. Grace flourished, growing taller and more confident, riding Dusty independently and handling chores with minimal supervision. She had enrolled in school for the fall and was reading at a level that impressed even the teacher. One October evening, almost exactly a year since Ethan had first arrived, they held a small celebration to mark the occasion. Dr. Harrison came along with the Swensons, the Coopers, and several other families who had gradually become friends rather than distant neighbors. They ate roasted chicken and fresh bread and vegetables from the garden, and someone asked Ethan to tell the story of how he had come to be there. He narrated it with Sarah and Grace filling in details he had forgotten or never known. And when they reached the end, Grace said, "That's when I knew Pa was going to stay forever. Because he came back when he said he would, and he kept every promise he made. That's what family does." After the guests had left and Grace had fallen asleep, Ethan and Sarah sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. This had become their ritual, this quiet time together at day's end when they could simply exist without demands or responsibilities pressing on them. "I have something to tell you," Sarah said, and something in her tone made Ethan turn to look at her carefully. She was smiling, but there was nervousness underneath it, an uncertainty that made his heart skip. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "About 3 months along, the doctor thinks. He confirmed it when he was here checking on the Swenson baby last week." The world seemed to stop for a moment, all sound and sensation narrowing to those three words and what they meant. A baby, a child, another chance at the family Ethan had thought was lost forever. His throat closed up completely, tears burning behind his eyes. "Ethan," Sarah's voice held worry now. "Say something. Are you... Is this all right? I know we didn't plan this so soon, but..." He pulled her close, holding her, like she was the most precious thing in existence, which she was. "It's more than all right," he managed to say past the emotion clogging his throat. "It's everything. It's proof that second chances are real, that we really did build something worth having." Sarah relaxed against him, her own tears falling now. "I was so scared you'd think it was too soon, that you weren't ready." "I'm terrified," Ethan admitted. "Absolutely terrified. But I'm also happier than I can remember being. And I'm ready to try again, to do it right this time with a partner who won't let me carry everything alone, who will make me ask for help when I need it." Spring arrived with the sudden warmth that characterized Montana's transition from winter. Sarah's pregnancy had advanced to its final weeks, and Dr. Harrison visited regularly, his concern evident, though he tried to hide it behind professional demeanor. "The lung scarring from the pneumonia worries me," he told Ethan privately one afternoon. "It could complicate the delivery. Her breathing might not be strong enough for the kind of exertion labor requires. What can we do? Be prepared, have her rest as much as possible, and when the time comes, send for me immediately. Don't wait." The labor began early one morning when Sarah's water broke. Grace was immediately sent to fetch Dr. Harrison, riding Dusty with the skills Ethan had taught her, skills that were now proving essential. She returned with the doctor in record time, having pushed the horse hard across the 8 miles. What followed were hours that felt like days. Sarah was strong, but the labor was difficult. Her breathing grew labored exactly as the doctor had feared, each contraction leaving her gasping for air that her damaged lungs struggled to provide. Ethan stayed at her side, refusing to leave despite the doctor's suggestion that he wait outside. "I'm here," he said over and over, his hand gripping hers. "I'm right here. You're not alone." As the hours stretched on, Sarah's strength began to flag. Her face had gone pale, and even between contractions, her breathing came in short, desperate gasps. Dr. Harrison's expression grew increasingly grave, and Ethan could see him making calculations, weighing terrible options. "Sarah," the doctor said firmly, "I need you to listen to me. We may need to make some difficult choices to hear." "No." Sarah's voice was weak but fierce. "I'm not losing this baby. I've lost too much already. Not this, not him." She found strength from somewhere deep, some reserve of will that Ethan had seen before but never fully appreciated until this moment. One final tremendous effort, a scream that seemed to tear from her very soul, and then the baby was there. The cry that filled the cabin was the most beautiful sound Ethan had ever heard. Small and lusty and full of outrage at being brought into the cold world. Dr. Harrison worked quickly clearing the infant's airway-checking vitals with practiced efficiency. "He's perfect," the doctor announced, a smile breaking through his professional mask. 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs. A healthy boy. Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but alive, her chest heaving as she fought for breath. Ethan found himself crying as the doctor placed his son in his arms for the first time. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile, and yet the weight of him felt like the weight of the entire world made manifest. "Thank you," Ethan whispered to Sarah, his tears falling freely now. "Thank you for fighting, for staying, for giving me this." Sarah's eyes were closed, but she managed a weak smile. "What should we name him?" Ethan did not hesitate. "James, after your first husband. Because he built the foundation we're standing on. Because honoring the man who came before is important." Sarah's expression melted into something that looked like love and gratitude and understanding all mixed together. "James Thomas Cole," she said. "Perfect." Grace, who had been watching from the doorway with wide eyes, came forward to meet her brother. She touched his tiny hand with one finger, her face filled with wonder. "He's so small. We have to protect him, Pa." "We will, sweetheart," Ethan said. "All of us together." Epilogue, Montana Ranch, Autumn 1912. Ethan's voice faded into the evening air, and William sat absorbing the weight of what he had heard. The Montana night had descended fully now, stars brilliant in their multitudes overhead. From inside the house came the sound of his grandmother calling them to dinner, but neither man moved. "So the baby you held that morning," William said quietly, "was my father." "Your father," Ethan confirmed. "James Thomas Cole, named after a man I never met, but whose legacy I lived in every day. This cabin, this ranch, it all started because James Bennett built something solid, and because his wife was brave enough to fight for it, and his daughter was brave enough to ask a stranger for help." William stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the land that had been home to 3 generations of his family. "I understand now why you told me this story. Do you? You're telling me that when I head west tomorrow, I'm not running away from something. I'm running towards something. And that difference matters." Ethan joined him at the railing, his hand resting on his grandson's shoulder. "That's part of it. But more important, you're telling me that when I face challenges, when I'm tempted to handle everything myself, I should remember that the strongest men aren't the ones who need nothing. They're the ones brave enough to accept help and to build something with others." "Exactly." Ethan's grip tightened slightly. 35 years ago, I was running from pain, convinced that needing nothing from anyone was strength. Then I heard a child crying and I stopped. That one decision, that one moment of choosing to help instead of riding on it, gave me everything. This ranch, your grandmother Sarah, your father, you, and all because I was brave enough to stop running. He paused, letting the words settle. "So when you head west, William, remember this. It's fine to be afraid. It's fine to not have all the answers. But don't make the mistake of thinking you have to do it all alone. Build with people. Accept help. Offer it freely. That's how you create something that lasts." William embraced his grandfather, holding tight for a long moment. "Thank you. For the story. For everything." "You're going to do fine," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've got a good foundation. Your father raised you right, just like Sarah and I raised him. Will you tell me about Father someday? About his life, his choices? When you come back from the West with your own stories to tell, then we'll sit here again and I'll tell you about the man who carried 2 names and honored both of them with how he lived." Morning came too soon, as it always does when you wish time would slow. William prepared to leave his horse, packed with supplies, everything ready for the journey that would take him toward his own uncertain future. He said goodbye to his grandmother, Sarah, who at 63 was still strong and clear-eyed, still the stubborn woman who had fought pneumonia in childbirth and 100 other hardships to build this life. He said goodbye at his father's grave at the edge of the property where James Thomas Cole rested beside the grandfather he had been named for, the 2 men's legacies forever intertwined. And then he said goodbye to Ethan standing on the same porch where the old man had stood 35 years ago, deciding whether to stay or go. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop running, Ethan said as William swung into the saddle. And sometimes the hardest thing is letting someone you love ride toward their own horizon. But that's what we do for people we care about. We give them a foundation to stand on and trust they'll build something good. William nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He turned his horse toward the west and rode away, and Ethan watched until he disappeared over the rise, that same rise where he had first seen the Bennett cabin all those years ago. Sarah emerged from the house and slipped her hand into his. They stood together in comfortable silence, the kind that only came from decades of choosing each other day after day. Grace, now a woman of 42 with children of her own, came out with her family 3 generations standing on land built by a fourth man they had never met, but whose spirit lived in every nail and board. "He'll be fine," Sarah said quietly. "I know." Ethan squeezed her hand. "He's got a good foundation." They looked at each other with the understanding that came from a lifetime lived together through good times and hard times and prosperity and want, exactly as they had promised in those vows 34 years ago in a small church in Willow Creek. "You know," Sarah said, a smile touching her lips, "sometimes I think about that day Grace found you on the trail, about how close we came to you riding past, about how different everything would have been if you had chosen to keep moving." "I think about it too," Ethan admitted. "Think about the man I was then, broken and running, convinced I'd used up my allotment of happiness. And I marvel at the distance between that man and who I became." "Who we became together," Sarah corrected gently. "Yes, together." He pulled her close, and they stood watching the sun climb higher over the Montana ranch, over the land they had built, through shared work and shared dreams and the daily choice to keep showing up for each other, no matter what challenges arose. The road ahead was uncertain, as it always was, but they would face it together, this family forged in crisis and sustained by commitment, this family that had started with a child crying and a man brave enough to stop and listen. And somewhere out there, William was riding toward his own destiny, carrying with him the wisdom of a grandfather who had learned through hard experience that the strongest thing a person could do was not to need nothing from anyone but to let people in, despite the fear to build connections, despite the risk to choose hope, despite having every reason to choose isolation instead. The drifter had found his home. The widow had found her second chance. The child who had asked a stranger for help had grown into a woman who knew the power of reaching out. And the baby born in that cabin, named for a man who had built with his hands and his heart, had grown into a father who taught his own son those same lessons about foundation and legacy and the courage it takes to build something that lasts. The sun was warm on Ethan's face, and Sarah's hand was steady in his, and the land stretched out before them, full of promise and memory in equal measure. This was what it meant to stop running. This was what it meant to choose. This was what it meant to be home. And it had all started with the sound of a child crying and the decision to do the necessary thing, the difficult thing, the brave thing, to simply stop and help.